I'm glad I could bring some estrogen to the podium here, although honestly I don't really have all that much. But I know that's TMI at this point in my life. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about keeping up with the rapid pace of change, and it's interesting because many of the things that I'm going to be talking about certainly common themes to other what other speakers have talked about. But quick raise of hands here. How many of you feel like we're living in a period of unprecedented change right now? Right, it feels that way. I do too. Sweeping social change, political uncertainty absolutely everywhere. New, better, faster technologies being launched at an absolute frenetic pace. But if you think back over the course of history, you'll see that every generation since the Renaissance believes that they've lived through a period of unprecedented change like never before. So let's consider an example of the generation exactly 100 years ago, 1913. That was the year that Henry Ford introduced the assembly line. Conveyor belts, people standing in one place with parts actually coming to them, mass production, all brand new. Of course, today we can't imagine a world in manufacturing without assembly lines. Before 1913, the post office only delivered letters and postcards. After 1913, actually in that year, they started to deliver packages. This is important not only because delivering packages, being able to send packages to one another is a great thing, but it also enabled mail order shopping, catalog shopping, and all of the infrastructure implications which laid the ground for companies such as Amazon and Zappos to exist. And for any of you following Downton Abbey, like me, and I can't believe they killed Matthew, I'm sorry if I gave that away, but oh my God, I'm sorry. I know. You'll know that 1913 was the prelude to what was called then the Great War, the war to end all wars. Of course, we know now that that was wishful thinking. Sorry, I know you're upset about that comment, the Matthew comment. I'm so sorry. But, you know, it's been a while since that aired. So the events of 1913 and the years soon to follow were just harbingers of things to come. As the 20th century progressed, change just kept on coming at an ever-accelerating pace. But in any given moment, somehow we feel like the change that is happening in our lives at the current time must be unprecedented. But we really couldn't be more wrong in thinking about that. Let's consider for a moment just the 25-year period between 1986 and 2011, one generation. The first 5 years of that period had a number of unprecedented events. The stock market crashed with a 508-point drop in one day. The business pages read like the crime pages, with Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky going to prison for junk bond scandals and insider trading. And the U.S. sent troops to the Middle East and North Africa for the first Gulf War. Well, let's fast forward a few years and see that we entered another period of unique change, right? The stock market crashed after the dot-com bubble burst. The Wall Street Journal read like the crime pages with the implosion of Enron and the bankruptcy of Arthur Andersen. And we sent U.S. troops to war again in the Gulf. So let's fast forward one more time to a more recent period where, again, a period of once-in-a-lifetime change, right? So we saw the financial meltdown. The stock market crashed 5,000 points in 6 months. We saw the business pages read like the crime pages with Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scandal and other major insider trading scandals. And again, the U.S. was pulled into war in an armed conflict in Libya. So what's pretty obvious about all of these examples is change is actually not new. In fact, change is constant, but what is new is the pace of change. And this has come up in multiple conversations so far today. And a prior speaker spoke about something similar to this, but this metric is a little bit different. I'm sure many of you have seen this bouncing around the internet. It's how many years it took certain technologies to reach 50 million people. You see it took 38 years for radio, 13 for TV, 4 for the web, 3 for the first iPod, 2 for Facebook, and 88 days for Google Plus to register 50 million users. Pretty incredible. So I think it's hard for a single person to adapt to this velocity of change. And the real question, I think, is how do companies of any size or scale keep up with this pace? Well, one way historically is to listen to your customers. It's not a new concept. César Ritz of Ritz Hotel fame said over 100 years ago, "Le client n'a jamais tort." I have been practicing that for a month. I am not kidding you. Or, and I think I said that pretty well, or the client is never wrong is what that means in English. And the saying that was made popular by 2 department store pioneers in this country is the customer is always right, to get their employees to try to listen to their customers. Well, more recently, there was a Harvard Business Review article, and it was one of the more popular ones ever written, called "Staple Yourself to an Order." And in it, the authors argue that it's important to understand your business from the perspective of your customers, from how your customers hear about you, to their buying process, to how they use your product, to after they've bought from you, and then whether they come back for more or not. They claim that in most businesses, the senior people are too disengaged from customers, and that the frontline employees are too siloed or disempowered to do much about customer input. The author's contention is that systematic and pervasive customer feedback and reaction to that feedback is the way to build sustainable competitive advantage. And I don't think any of us would disagree with that. But it's great in theory. The practical issue is something that I like to call the Winnie the Pooh dilemma. I don't know how many of you have read the Winnie the Pooh books, the very early ones, but the very first book, on the very first page, there's a picture of the little boy, Christopher Robin, coming downstairs with the teddy bear being dragged behind him. And the text says, "Here is Edward Bear coming downstairs now, bump, 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 on the back of the head behind Christopher Robin. As far as he knows, that's the only way of coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels like there's another way. If only he could stop bumping his head for long enough to think about it." And I think this describes what many managers and companies around the world feel when they're confronted with this very rapid pace of change. They feel like there might be a better way to do things, or there's something they ought to be paying attention to, but they can't really stop what they're doing long enough to figure it out. So I think the sad casualty of the speed of change is that companies stop seeking truly systematic and pervasive feedback from their customers. Now, that's not to say that all companies haven't kept up. There's been a lot of innovation in recent years about getting customer feedback. It's hard to believe that the word beta, up until fairly recently, used to mean to most people just a Greek letter or part of the failed video player standard Betamax. But that all changed in 1993 when Mosaic, that then morphed into Netscape, began the beta revolution. And that was their big innovation. They purposefully released versions of the software into the public that were clearly unfinished so they could get feedback on what was wrong and they could make it better. So in some ways, this is analogous to focus group testing a prototype, except for in the case of Netscape, they had an N of 8 million instead of an N of 8. Now, for those of you who have apps on your phone, which I'm sure is absolutely every one of you, I see some of you checking those right now, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the concept of these rapid update cycles. New releases coming out sometimes daily, even weekly. This was made popular by the lean startup movement, led by Eric Ries's book, which is based on the imperative of getting customer feedback early and often. Kickstarter and other similar sites are now helping companies launch products even faster than that. Customers could vote with their dollars on which products should be built even before the prototypes are available. This is also like an old-fashioned focus group, except the customers are actually paying for the privilege of providing their feedback. Another recent innovation that we've heard a lot about is data mining from social media, and this is all great, and no one could deny that progress is being made. But the issue is that more often than not, these efforts tend to be isolated, superficial, not linked, and pervasive. So efforts being expended, but it doesn't always translate into companies keeping up. There are examples, of course. Apple's well known for its attention to detail, pervasively incorporating customer thinking into every aspect of their business, from the physical design of their products to the user interfaces to retail stores, Genius bars for service and support. Now, while Steve Jobs didn't necessarily buy into the concept of traditional market research, they really did staple themselves to the order and looked through every aspect of their business through the eyes of their customer. And I think as a result, they really set the standard in their industry and arguably across industries. Other companies that have set great examples are companies like Amazon. They are relentless in thinking through issues from their customer's perspective, not only the online interface, but across the board. For example, Amazon heard from their customers that they were having difficulty, they were actually complaining about the amount of packaging that was coming with their products, and also difficulty opening certain packages. So they worked with their manufacturers to streamline packaging for many of its products. And they were really brilliant in taking this learning, this insight from the market, and making it a cost-saving initiative for them, as well as a win for their customers. Zappos, they literally wrote the book on seeking customer feedback and being customer-focused. In fact, I think they're on their third book now. It's pervasive to their culture. So what all of these companies have in common is that they took the pace of change and made it an advantage for them. They said, let's use every mechanism we can to find out what our customers want on every aspect of our business, and then make decisions based on that input. But all of these examples are in the B2C space. My company, InCrowd, as Kristen said, we operate in the life science world, in the B2B space. And I'm sure many of you have B2B businesses as well. But I believe that what happens in the B2C space eventually moves to B2B. And I think that that's happening here, and I think the time is now for that migration. Of course, let's see, life science companies, my world, are slightly more complicated than average businesses. They have regulators, payers, key opinion leaders, doctors, patients. But I think the day is coming, because I'm starting to see it with our clients, that leading pharma companies will start to think as pervasively about their businesses as Apple or Zappos, and rapidly extract information from all their different stakeholders and move it swiftly into action. This list is a list of areas where real-time feedback could be incorporated in the life science world. I think marketing and messaging are obvious examples, but being able to listen to payers and caregivers in real time, say about reimbursement support, could give companies distinct advantages over their competitors. And even more important in my world is getting feedback from doctors, a notoriously difficult stakeholder population to gain access to. So to put a framework around what I've been talking about, I see a 4Ds approach. I know one of the speakers earlier had a 10Ds approach, so that trumps my 4Ds, but I've got 4 of them. And this, I think, is a way of thinking about how to obtain fast and pervasive feedback and encourage rapid reaction and adaptation. The first is different communities or segmentation. I'm sure this is not a new concept for anybody in this room. But I think the more focused the audience is, the better the feedback will be. The second is distinct mechanisms. Each community may need its own means of engagement. At InCrowd, we're finding that smartphones is a very good source of direct feedback to doctors, for example, because we know that we're getting to them directly, and we're getting responses from them in real time, almost immediately. We think about their day, and we've created a vehicle to work well within the confines of their day. We use micro-surveys. We give them opportunities to provide feedback on the fly between patients waiting for an elevator, or am I completely out of time? Okay, so the next is dashboards. You really need a way not only to collect the information, but to be able to visualize it and coordinate it so it's digestible. And then decision makers, and I think this is really the hardest part. having decision makers take that information and actually incorporate it into how they do business. And some ways that we see that is really, really useful in there is to incorporate it into a weekly meeting or a way that everyone is getting together. There are usually tons of priorities. You got to just pick one off. You got to start making progress, and you got to start incorporating it into the system of how you do business. And if you do that and start to see the results, it's going to start to become addictive, kind of like dieting. When you start to see the weight coming off, you want to do it more. I think incorporating feedback in this way is very similar in the sense that it becomes addictive once you really see the results. So, you know, change is constant. It's how we react to it that's really going to make a difference. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lana.